The stem of my wine glass was cool in my hand when my father tapped his spoon against crystal and bright as a stadium announcer said, "Ladies and gentlemen, here's the biggest screw-up in our family." He didn't hide the smile. He wanted the whole church hall to hear it, every aunt from Abilene, every high school friend in Boots, every former football buddy of my brother's. Laughter came quick, ricocheting off wood paneling. Near the sheet cake, a chair scraped. A guest half rose. "Wait," he said, voice catching. The air tightened the way it does before a storm. I let the glass touch my lip, but didn't drink. I have learned the value of silence. I have learned the mercy of timing. The organist had packed up her hymns, but the hall still smelled like coffee and polished barbecue, drifting from the parking lot, roses crushed on a sticky floor. The Texas evening pressed its warmth against the windows. Fairy lights made halos out of strangers. My brother in a rented tux swaggered between tables collecting pats as though he'd scored one more fourth-quarter touchdown. My sister glowed beside her new mother-in-law, church smile perfect. Dad loved a microphone. He didn't need one. His voice carried like a coach's after years of Friday nights. He raised his glass, nodded toward the bride and groom. The room hushed. He gave them 9 words of sentiment, and because the shape of his joy required a sacrifice, he turned to me. "This one," he said, pointing with his glass, "my youngest, she's always been, well." The pause was theater. He gathered an audience that was already his. Bless her heart, he grinned, the biggest screw-up in our family. My brother's friends brayed. A cousin covered her mouth. Someone whistled. I could have stood and read the citations, named the ship's counted deployments against the quiet that follows each homecoming. I could have set rank on the table beside the plastic forks. But there is a way to win that leaves everyone smaller, and a way to win that changes the air. I kept my seat. I let my jaw unclench. The AC kicked on that familiar August clatter. Condensation crawled down Dad's glass. He was still a handsome man, square shoulders, coach's stance. A belly that meant well. Growing up, he'd carted us through Sonic drive-thrus, to football games, to the same pew every Sunday. He believed in effort and in winning. He believed in telling a story out loud until it became the only one people remembered. He told a great many stories about me. Y'all remember sophomore year, he boomed, jogging a step like he might run a play. This girl tried out for track, tripped the first hurdle, popped right back up, and finished dead last. Bless her heart, laughter. He was rewriting it as he spoke. In my memory, I finished middle of the pack. But narratives are rivers, and he held the damn keys. Mom's mouth tightened into the shy smile she used when she didn't agree but wouldn't ruin things. My sister angled her bouquet like a shield. A deacon's wife slid her gaze from me to the tablecloth as if kindness were contagious, and she might catch it at the wrong time. I set my wine glass on the white cloth blue cornflowers printed along the edge and noticed a water ring bleeding outward. I moved the glass. Old habits contain the spill, contain the situation. He kept going because a crowd is a furnace, and he'd found dry wood. She left town on a whim, he said, signed up for God knows what, like it was summer camp. We figured she'd be back in 2 weeks, asking for her room. He wagged his head, benevolent in the way men are benevolent when they're sure they're right. But hey, she's here tonight. That counts for something. He made it sound like I'd wandered home with empty pockets and a suitcase of mistakes. The man by the cake stood straighter now, hand on his chair mouth parting for a word he hadn't chosen. He wore dress whites. Even at the edge of my vision, I knew the weight of that fabric, the way it sits on your shoulders like truth. My spine knew, before my eyes did what was about to happen to the room. "Dad," my brother said, half laughing, tugging his sleeve. He was enjoying the show, but he'd learned Mom's etiquette of ceilings. There is a height to cruelty that respectable people observe. Dad swatted him off with the easy affection reserved for sons who never have to apologize. "Listen," he said over the murmur. "I love all my kids, even this one." The buffoonery gave him cover. She just never figured out what she wanted to be. My pulse slowed. That old feeling, like the seconds before a blast when the world tightens to a pinhole and then widens to the horizon, spread across my chest. I thought of sand, like ground glass in Fallujah, of engine rooms hot as sin of charts with contested lines and briefings that read like weather for tempests. I thought of the names I carry under my sternum unseen when I'm in a dress. And then the man in whites cleared his throat. "Wait," he said, not loudly, but in a tone that opens doors. Another man beside him turned. A silvered shoe glinted beneath his chair. Outside, a train horn sounded lonely. Dad glanced over, irritated at the interruption, then faced the room to finish his bit. He had a closing line, I could see it forming. He would bless the couple, wrap the insult in a ribbon, call it a joke, and go home to sleep like an honest man. I raised my glass and finally took a sip. The wine was church budget sweet, but it steadied my hand. I caught Mom's eye. She gave me a faint nod. Permission apology prayer. The room was listing a ship caught by a new wind. "Wait!" the man repeated, and chairs began to scrape. I put my glass back on the cornflowers and folded my napkin a tidy square. My hands, which have held lives and signatures and flags, did not shake. I didn't speak. Not yet. Sometimes the holiest thing you can do is let a moment hear itself. I had grown up in that same town, the one with a single high school, where football games were the heartbeat of Friday nights, where the Dairy Queen was both a landmark and a gathering place. I can still hear the echo of cleats on the metal bleachers, my brother's name booming from the loudspeaker as quarterback Dad, standing proud in the stands with both arms raised like he'd thrown the touchdown himself. For me, childhood was a different kind of stadium. I was the girl who tried every sport, tripped on hurdles, slid late into bases, fouled out of basketball games. At home, those moments never ended. Dad retold them at barbecues, family picnics, church potlucks, spinning each stumble into comedy. "Bless her heart," he'd say, shaking his head with mock pity, my little screw-up. Always trying, never quite making it. The grown-ups laughed. I laughed too back then, because children learn early that laughing along is safer than standing apart. But in bed at night, I stared at the ceiling fan and whispered promises to myself. I wasn't going to be the joke forever. I wasn't going to be the shadow trailing behind my brother's glory and my sister's perfection. Thanksgiving dinners were rehearsals for humiliation. Dad carved the turkey, poured himself a glass of sweet tea, and launched into stories. My brother's football trophies, my sister's perfect GPA, the boy she was dating, whose family owned half the town. Then his gaze would land on me. This one. She's still figuring it out. A pause. A smirk. But we love her anyway. The table chuckled like it was all good fun. My cheeks burned hotter than the oven. Once when I was 13, I tried to show him my science project, carefully wired circuits that lit up bulbs in sequence. He tapped the board, barely looking. "That's fine, honey, but you'll never beat your brother's trophies." I carried the project back to my room, the bulbs flickering in my hands, and swore that one day I'd build something brighter than any stadium light he'd ever cheered under. At church, the preacher spoke of talents and gifts. My talent, people assumed, was resilience. I was the girl who took it on the chin, who could laugh at herself. No one noticed that every laugh carved a deeper groove. I wore those grooves like medals no one else could see. High school brought more of the same. Teachers adored my sister, who was polite, pretty, and destined for homecoming court. Coaches adored my brother, who could throw a ball 50 yards under pressure. Me, I was the one they put in when the score was already decided. Dad clapped hard anyway, but it was the clap of obligation, not pride. I remember standing outside the gym after a game, the night air, cool neon buzzing overhead. My brother emerged with teammates slapping backs, laughter spilling into the parking lot. Dad rushed to him, draped an arm over his shoulder, beaming. I lingered by the door, sneakers, scuffing pavement, waiting. Dad turned, eventually caught sight of me, and said, "You'll find your thing, honey. Maybe cheerleading." My throat tightened. I wanted to scream that I'd already found my thing, that I was working harder than anyone, but the words never made it past my lips. It wasn't that I hated my family. I loved them in the way children are wired to love, even those who bruise them. But love tangled with disappointment, resentment, longing. I wanted my father's approval more than oxygen, and every laugh he earned at my expense was another withheld breath. By 17, I had mastered silence. I let jokes roll past me, let nicknames screw up clumsy, our little lost cause, stick like burrs to my sleeves. Outwardly, I smiled. Inwardly, I sharpened each word into a blade. I began running before dawn, not for track, but for myself. I pushed push-ups until my arms quivered. I read about military history when others flipped through fashion magazines. Somewhere between laps around the football field and the biographies of Navy admirals, I felt a compass click into place. Still, I kept that secret. Dad would have laughed. The military? You honey, you can't even keep your room clean. So I folded the dream into silence, a seed waiting in dry soil. Years later, when I signed those enlistment papers, the recruiter asked why. I thought of the ceiling fan, spinning over a girl's whispered promises. I thought of Thanksgiving tables and jokes that tasted like ash. I thought of neon buzzing above a gym, of Dad's proud arm around someone else. I didn't tell the recruiter all that. I just said, because I need to prove something. But those childhood nights, those small-town humiliations never left me. They rode with me like silent passengers, shaping the steel in my spine. Every laugh that once bent me down would one day lift me higher. I just didn't know how high yet. Boot camp did not care who your father was, or whether you were the family screw-up. It cared about sweat, about whether your body obeyed when shouted at, about how much grit you could dredge up when your arms were jelly and your lungs burned like fire. The first morning, I stood in line at 0500 with a buzz cut still prickling my scalp, watching the sun bleed over the horizon, and I thought, at last, here's a place where no one laughs when you fall. They just make you get back up. I got back up, again and again. Push-ups on asphalt until the skin of my palms felt like rawhide. Laps around the barracks until blisters split. You'll never make it. Dad's voice replayed in my head every time I thought about quitting, and it drove me harder than any drill instructor could. The Navy became my forge. I learned to carry weight that wasn't mine alone. Packs gear the lives of the sailor next to me. I learned that silence wasn't weakness, it was control. And when orders came down for my first deployment, I signed without hesitation. Iraq, 2004, Fallujah. Sand so fine it crept into your teeth, your boots, the folds of your soul. The first firefight cracked the air like God snapping kindling. I wasn't infantry, but combat doesn't always respect lines. I held pressure on a Marine's leg while bullets chipped concrete. Blood was slick warm. His eyes locked on mine. He lived. That night, under the noise of distant artillery, I wrote his name in a small notebook I kept folded into my pocket. That book would grow heavier with time. From the desert heat to the sting of salt spray, South China Sea patrols followed. The sea has its own kind of menace, quiet, endless, dotted with shadows on radar that make you wonder which wave hides an enemy. Long nights I stared at the chart table. Coffee cold, tracing contested lines with my finger, knowing any misstep could ignite something larger than all of us. It was there in that gray tension that I earned trust. Not because I spoke loud, but because I spoke true. Decisions made under pressure that held. Orders that protected lives. By then I had learned how to make my voice cut through noise without raising it. Respect grew slowly, but it rooted deep. Joint operations with the SEALs were another crucible. Men built like oak trees, eyes sharp, testing every newcomer with the weight of silence. I didn't try to impress. I simply worked. I carried gear until straps dug trenches in my shoulders. I studied maps until dawn. One night after a successful op, a SEAL clapped me on the back. Solid work, Hayes. Just 3 words, but they landed heavier than any cheer I'd ever begged for in high school. Rank came not as a gift, but as a ledger, balanced. Lieutenant, commander, captain. Each step a scar stitched over with discipline. Medals gathered in drawers, ribbons in neat rows. My notebook of names thickened. Some survived, some didn't. They were the true weight of rank, heavier than any bar or star. Back home, phone calls with Dad were short, perfunctory. "You still over there?" He'd ask, tone distracted. When you coming back for Thanksgiving? I'd answer politely, never mentioning the medals, never explaining what the stars on my shoulder meant. Once I hinted I'm up for a big promotion. He chuckled. That's good, honey. But when are you getting a real job? The words lodged like shrapnel. I carried them with me through storms at sea, through the thunder of aircraft lifting off decks, through memorial services, where folded flags pressed against widows' chests. His dismissal became another kind of fuel. I wasn't looking for revenge in those years. I was building something steadier. Yet each time I stood at attention, hearing my name attached to responsibility, I thought of that small-town gym parking lot where he'd slung an arm around my brother and told me to try cheerleading, and I knew my path wasn't theirs to define. By the time the orders came, by the time the uniform gleamed with the weight of command, I was no longer the girl who tripped hurdles. I was an officer trusted to steer through storms. And still back home, Dad introduced me as the one still figuring it out. That's why sitting at that wedding table years later, his laughter rolling over me like it always had, I didn't flinch. Because beneath the sting was steel. Beneath his joke was everything I had already overcome. And when a guest in navy whites turned and froze, recognition dawning in his eyes, I knew the reckoning had finally come. The organ's last notes had barely faded when Dad seized the room the way he always did. Shoulders square chest, outglass raised high. The church hall smelled of brisket and buttercream, the kind of mix only a small-town Texas wedding could brew. Paper lanterns swung overhead, scattering light across folding tables draped in rented cloth. People leaned back in metal chairs, plates still sticky with barbecue sauce. Dad cleared his throat with a coach's authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's give it up for my boy," he boomed, gesturing to my brother in his tux. Applause burst forth. My brother beamed, soaking in the sound like a quarterback basking in stadium cheers. Dad slapped him on the back, adding from Friday Night Lights to a business empire, still making his old man proud. More applause whistles. He shifted to my sister, who stood by her new mother-in-law bouquet in hand. And this one, Dad announced beautiful, smart, and married into a fine family. Always knew how to make the right choices. The room murmured approval. My sister flushed pink eyes, dropping in practiced modesty. Then his gaze turned to me. I felt it. Before it landed, the way you sense lightning about to strike. He grinned, glass still raised, and the pause was deliberate. He wanted the silence, the crowd leaning forward, the stage set for his punchline. And this one, he said, his voice dropping into mock solemnity. My youngest. Bless her heart. He shook his head with exaggerated pity. This is the biggest screw-up in our family. The words landed like a slap. The crowd erupted. My brother's friends guffawed, slapping the table. A cousin whistled. An uncle nearly choked on his beer. Even the deacon's wife covered her mouth as though laughter were an obligation. I sat still, hands folded on my lap. The stem of my wine glass pressed cool into my palm. Inside, the steel I'd built over years at sea held firm. Outwardly, I let the insult wash over me like surf against a hull. Dad wasn't done. The crowd's laughter was oxygen, and he inhaled deep. Y'all remember her track tryout he went on pantomiming? A runner's fall. First hurdle, bam, flat on her face. Finished dead last. We called it the Hayes family highlight reel. Laughter doubled over. My brother shook his head, smirking. He glanced at me as though expecting me to laugh along. I met his eyes without flinching lips, still offering no relief. The silence between us was louder than the laughter. Mom shifted in her seat, her smile tight as a drawn bowstring. She reached for his sleeve, once subtle, but he brushed it off, too busy feeding his audience. Truth is, Dad continued, we never knew what this girl was going to do. Never settled down, never had a plan. Off chasing some kind of adventure, like it was summer camp. But hey, she showed up tonight. He chuckled, raising his glass. That counts for something. The laughter rang hollow now, a little strained, but still enough to carry. I let my gaze drift over the tables, football buddies in bolo ties, neighbors from our cul-de-sac, women from the church choir, people who had known me since childhood, who had chuckled at these stories for years. They thought they knew me still. I thought of the names in the notebook tucked into my dress uniform miles away. Names of men who'd bled into my hands, names of sailors buried at sea. They weren't here to clap or to laugh. They were part of the steel in my spine. The air shifted. A chair scraped near the back. A man in navy white straightened his ribbons, catching the lantern light. He froze, eyes locked on me. The laughter tapered, curiosity replacing it. He spoke, voice measured, but certain. "Wait, aren't you Admiral Hayes?" The words rippled across the hall. Forks stilled against plates. Glasses paused midair. Even the organist halfway through packing her hymns stopped moving. I met his gaze, then the eyes of everyone else turned on me. Slowly, I rose, smoothing the skirt of my dress, letting the silence stretch taut. I nodded once. "Yes, I am." Dad, still mid-sip, sputtered. Wine sprayed across the tablecloth, darkening the cornflower print into bruised petals. His eyes widened, the flush of laughter, draining into something paler. The room held its breath. In that moment, the power shifted. No need for shouting, no need for defense. The truth stood on its own, gleaming sharper than any insult. The silence after the guest's question stretched like the space between thunder and lightning. For years, I had imagined a moment like this, never knowing when it might come, never daring to script it too neatly. But here it was, unfolding in the quiet of a small-town church hall, dressed with fairy lights and barbecue smoke. The man in whites repeated firmer. "This time, you're Admiral Hayes, aren't you?" His voice carried not loud, but undeniable, the tone of someone accustomed to truth. Heads turned as though pulled on invisible strings. I stood. Not hurried, not defensive. My chair legs scraped softly against the wood floor. The fabric of my dress whispered as I smoothed it down. My heart beat steady, each thud, a drum I'd marched to across oceans. "Yes," I said, my voice even. "I am." The words hung in the air, clean and final. A woman near the cake gasped. Someone dropped a fork with a metallic clatter. My brother's grin faltered as if he'd misheard. My sister's bouquet trembled slightly in her hands. Dad froze mid-swallow. Then it happened. Wine spurting from his lips, a choking cough, his free hand slapping at his chest. The tablecloth bore the stain, a red bloom, spreading across cornflowers. His laughter, the sound that had always drowned me out, was gone. The hall was still. My title weighed more heavily than any insult he had ever cast, and everyone knew it. The man in whites straightened his spine, saluting before decorum even demanded it. "Admiral on deck," he said instinctively. The words ignited recognition. A ripple ran through the room. Veterans at tables shifted, rising slowly to their feet. One by one, men who had once worn uniforms themselves came to attention. They knew what the stars on a shoulder meant. They knew what it cost. I did not smile. I didn't need to. My silence was louder than any speech. Dad lowered his glass, fingers trembling. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He looked at me the way a man looks at the scoreboard when the game is lost. Disbelief turning to something harsher, fear maybe, or shame. For once, he had no story ready, no joke, no easy laugh to win the crowd. The guests shifted, unease buzzing through them like static. People who had chuckled at Dad's words minutes earlier now avoided my eyes. My mother dabbed at her napkin. Her gaze lowered, but a sheen of pride flickered across her face before she could hide it. I remained standing, shoulders, square posture, automatic from years of command. Every muscle remembered what to do to project calm, to anchor chaos. I let them see me, the daughter they had dismissed, the woman they had overlooked, the admiral they had laughed at without knowing. No one spoke. The hum of the air conditioner filled the void, the clink of ice melting in glasses. I could almost hear the names in my notebook, the voices of those I carried. "You've earned this," they seemed to say. Dad cleared his throat as though preparing to recover. But there was nothing left to recover. His authority had cracked, his narrative shattered. The man who had coached entire towns into laughter now faced silence that would not bend to him. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Revenge, I had learned sometimes. requires no fire, no fury, only truth revealed at the right time. And so I stood watching the faces shift, watching recognition bloom, until the weight of the moment settled into everyone's bones. Then I sat again, slow and deliberate, my wine untouched before me. The hall remained hushed, the taste of power inverted, the joke reversed. The reckoning had arrived, and it spoke in my stead. Silence can be a blade if you hold it right. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand on a chair or list my tours like trophies. I let the hush work, let the air settle heavy until even the paper lanterns seemed to stop swaying. Somewhere near the kitchen pass-through, a timer beeped twice and quit. The smell of brisket had cooled into something sweet and smoky, but no one reached for seconds. The man in whites kept his posture, the crease of his trousers, like a rule underlined. A few older men, Korean war caps, Vietnam pins, struggled up and straightened as if their knees remembered obedience better than comfort. Admiral, one of them, said softly and gave me a nod that weighed more than any plaque on a church wall. I inclined my head. It was enough. Dad brushed at the wine, staining the cornflowers, as if tidiness could reverse time. His hands, coach's hands, that had once signaled plays across fields, trembled. The glass clicked against the table. He looked at me, the way men look at strange seas, measuring depth and current, trying to find purchase where there isn't any. For decades, he'd held the microphone. Now the room had rewired itself around a frequency he couldn't hear. Mom folded her napkin into a triangle and set it carefully beside her plate. Her eyes were wet but steady. Maybe we should cut the cake, she suggested, voice thin, offering the room a ladder out of its embarrassment. No one moved. The bride reached for my sister's hand. My sister whispered, "Oh my God, not as gossip, not as judgment, but like prayer." My brother attempted a laugh. "Well, hey, learn something new every day," he said, aiming for charm and hitting the wall between us. He looked to Dad for rescue. None came. The deacon's wife smoothed her skirt and faced me. "We've been proud of your brother for years," she said, words, careful eyes, kinder than I remembered. "I'm sorry we didn't see you right." She held my gaze long enough to make apology a real thing, not a courtesy. Then she sat, and in her wake, others found their words. "I had no idea," said a neighbor who'd loaned us jumper cables and sugar over the years, as if the idea me a woman in a uniform of stars had been hidden under a tarp in the garage. "Thank you for your service," he added. But it wasn't rote. It was raw. "Ma'am," one of my brother's friends said, cheeks flushed above his bolo tie. I laughed. "I'm sorry." He sounded like a man admitting he'd taken the easy road too many times and found it didn't lead where he thought. I didn't do magnanimous speeches. I didn't absolve or accuse. I let them have the dignity of their own reckonings. "Thank you," I said when it fit. A nod, a breath, silence like clean water washing a wound. Dad found his voice thin at first, then louder out of habit. "Now hold on," he said like a referee stepping into a pileup. "We're making too big a deal of this." He tapped the table. "I was joking. Y'all know that. A little fun. We razz each other in this family." He gestured toward my brother, grasping at the old rhythm. "Don't we?" My brother didn't answer. He looked at me instead, and in that look, I saw a boy again, the one who shared a bedroom wall with me, who had passed notes under the door when Dad's expectations flattened the air. He shrugged helpless. "It wasn't a joke," I said. Not scolding, just the truth placed on the table between us like a plain loaf of bread. It never was. Dad flinched. You could have told us he tried, but even he heard the thinness. He didn't understand that some things are not told. They're born, and then one day they arrive full-grown and undeniable. The man in whites, his hair close-cropped, his face open, stepped closer. "Sir," he said to Dad, polite to the end. "Decorum asks that we recognize what's in front of us." Then to me, "Ma'am, permission to offer proper honors." I saw the question behind the words. Do you want this? Here now? The church hall, the brisket, the fairy lights, the football town that had measured me in yards, I never chose. "Keep it simple," I said. He nodded, once turned, and with a voice that carried to every corner, called attention. He caught himself, scaled it back out of respect for the setting, then raised 2 fingers to his brow. The veterans followed. A handful of younger men who had never served stood awkwardly, then straighter, finding the line through imitation. It was not a ceremony. It was a correction. Dad remained seated, hands flat on the tablecloth, as if pinning down a story that wanted to fly. "Congratulations on your marriage," I told my sister, finally giving the room a second rope to hold. The bride startled, then laughed on a breath. "Thank you," she said. "We're honored you're here." She meant it. It softened something in the air. A woman from the choir came to my mother with a stack of fresh napkins. "For the spill," she murmured, but her hand touched Mom's wrist in a way that said, "For other things too." They cleaned the wine together. The stain lightened, but did not disappear. Dad watched, jaw working. "You should have told me," he said again, but quieter, meant for me alone this time. "All those years." "I did," I answered, not unkindly. "Just not with words you listen for." His eyes found the stars that weren't on my shoulder tonight, but might as well have been. He swallowed. The coach, the storyteller, the man who filled rooms, it all sat there suddenly too heavy for the chair. "I thought I was pushing you," he said, searching for absolution he had not earned. "Making you tough." "You made me quiet," I said. "The rest I made myself." We held there. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But truth standing. Where laughter had lived. From the foyer came the shuffle of feet, the low murmur of new arrivals. The reception coordinator peeked in, flustered. "They're here," she whispered to the bride. "Your friends from base." My sister blinked, confused. The man in white smiled at me, as if to say, "The tide keeps its own calendar." I shook my head slightly. Not yet. Another moment to let the room breathe, to let Dad taste the flavor of a world that would not bend back into his favored shape. I rose again, not to command, but to release. "Enjoy the night," I said to no one and everyone. "There's a couple to celebrate." I touched my mother's shoulder. "Mom?" Her fingers closed around mine for an extra beat. The squeeze of a woman who has survived her own quiet wars. I looked at my brother. "Take care of her." He nodded, solemn now. My sister mouthed, "Thank you again," eyes bright. As I turned to go, Dad stood too quickly, chair legs screeching, knocking the table so the forks chimed. "Where are you going?" He asked the question raw, with something that sounded like loss. "For air," I said. "For honesty." Then, because mercy is a discipline, not a mood, I added, "I'll be outside." He took a step, stopped, swallowed pride like a bitter pill, and didn't follow. The man in whites fell in half a pace behind me without being asked. In the vestibule, the night waited full of crickets and late summer humidity, the parking lot lamps buzzing haloed cones into the darkness. I pushed the door and stepped through the change in temperature, a hand across my face. Behind me, the church hall began to move again, cutlery chatter and organ flourish as someone tried to tilt the evening back toward celebration. It would never be the same. That was the point. On the steps, I breathed. The brick was warm under my palm. Somewhere far off, a freight train moaned. The air tasted like mesquite and redemption. "Ma'am," the man in white said, quietly, as if careful not to wake the town. "There are some folks who'd like a word." I nodded. The night had work left to do. The night air outside the church hall carried the smell of cut grass and mesquite smoke, thick with late summer humidity. Crickets sang in the fields, and the parking lot buzzed with sodium lamps casting amber halos. I stood on the steps, letting the warmth settle into my bones, the cool brick beneath my palm grounding me after the storm inside. My breath came steady. The silence here was not the silence of humiliation. It was the silence of release. The man in white stood half a step behind posture, respectful eyes forward. He didn't speak until I looked at him. "Admiral," he said softly, "there are some folks who'd like a word." I turned, and from the shadowed edge of the lot, figures emerged. Men and women in uniform, navy dress whites and khaki shoulders squared. Some I recognized instantly. SEALs from Joint Ops sailors from deployments long past. They must have driven from bases, hours away, slipping quietly into town just to be present tonight. The fairy lights inside had nothing on the gleam of their brass. They formed a line at the foot of the steps, boots crunching gravel. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, as if on cue, they raised their hands in salute. Admiral on deck, the man beside me, called, his voice ringing clear in the Texas night. The world slowed. I had been saluted countless times before, but never here, never with the childhood church hall at my back and the echo of my father's laughter still in my ears. These were not ceremonial motions. This was recognition, deliberate and undeniable, in the very town that had called me lost cause. I returned the salute hand, crisp at my brow. The gesture felt less like ritual and more like reclamation. Every laugh I had swallowed, every dismissal I had endured, forged into this moment. Behind me, the church doors creaked open. Conversations faltered. Guests spilled out onto the steps, drawn by the sudden stillness, by the sight of uniforms under yellow lamps. I heard whispers, "Oh my God, she really is!" A cousin muttered, "That's Admiral Hayes." The bride clutched my sister's hand, eyes wide. Dad appeared in the doorway, shoulders hunched as though the frame itself had shrunk him. His face was pale, his jaw slack. He looked at the line of salutes at me standing before them, and for the first time in my life, I saw him without a story to tell. The salute ended. The sailors dropped their hands in unison, and the sound of it was sharper than any applause. One stepped forward, a seal with weathered lines carved deep into his face. "Ma'am," he said, voice rough but steady, "we don't forget leadership. We don't forget who we'd follow into hell and back. We came here to remind you of that, and to let them see it." The words landed like a bell toll across the parking lot. No rebuttal, no laugh could erase them. I caught Dad's eyes. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. His glass was gone, his prop taken from him. He stood bare, exposed not by my anger, but by truth he had never thought possible. "I never needed your approval," I told him quietly, my voice carrying farther than I intended. "But I did deserve your respect." His lips trembled. I thought he began, and stopped. His throat worked around words that would not form. For once, the coach, the storyteller, the man who always had the last line, was silent. The veterans and sailors parted, leaving a path from the steps to the lot. The gesture was symbolic, unmistakable. A corridor of recognition, a gauntlet of dignity. I descended slowly, heels clicking against the concrete, each step punctuated by the echo of my own becoming. Guests spilled further out murmuring. Some clapped softly, some bowed their heads. A few, the same ones who had laughed the loudest at Dad's joke, turned red with shame. The church organist standing by the door, clutching her hymn book, whispered, "God bless you," as I passed. At the end of the line, a young sailor saluted me again. His eyes shone with something like awe. I returned it. Then I turned, facing everyone, the uniforms, the townsfolk, my family frozen in the doorway. "He called me a screw-up," I said, voice calm, carrying over the hum of the lamps and the night. "The world calls me Admiral." The words were not vengeance. They were truth carved clean. The seal stepped forward again. "We stand with you, ma'am. Always." I nodded, emotion thick in my chest. "Thank you," I said, my voice rough. The crowd held its silence. The night held its breath. And in that stillness, Dad's legacy of laughter finally cracked for good. I turned to leave. My footsteps rang steady, the echo of command. Behind me, the sailors dispersed into shadows, their presence lingering like constellations you know are there, even after clouds move in. The parking lot lights flickered, insects buzzing against the bulbs. I inhaled the warm night air, heavy with mesquite, and felt lighter than I had in decades. As I reached my car, I looked once more at the church hall. Through the open doors, I saw Dad still standing in the threshold, small against the glow of fairy lights. He didn't raise his glass again. He didn't speak. He just watched. And for once, I let him. Sometimes revenge doesn't roar, I thought. Sometimes it's the silence left after truth has spoken. I slid into the driver's seat, the uniform pressed crisp against me. Stars invisible to the crowd, but etched into every memory of those who knew. The ignition-turned headlights swept the lot, and I drove away. Not from shame, but toward a horizon I had already claimed. He called me a screw-up. The world calls me Admiral. If you've ever carried the weight of being underestimated, if you've ever borne laughter at your expense, only to rise higher than they dreamed, you know the power of silence, of truth, of standing tall when the world finally sees you. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories of dignity, reclaimed of voices finally heard. And hold close this reminder: respect is not given, it's earned, and it can never be taken away once it's yours.